Today, I want us to take a calm, honest look at how the modern state of Israel was actually formed in 1948. And I'm saying calm and honest very intentionally because this topic is one of the few where people speak with absolute confidence, yet most of us grew up hearing completely different versions of the story. If you are raised in many Christian circles, for example, you are likely taught that Israel's creation was a direct fulfillment of the biblical prophecy, not as history, not as politics, but as God unfolding his plan in real time. And that teaching shaped how millions of believers see 1948, not just as an event, but as something sacred, right? But if you sit with historians or read the archives or look at the political decisions that led to 1948, you get a very different explanation. Their version is not spiritual. It is grounded in European anti-Semitism, pogroms, world wars, colonial borders, and a century of Jewish communities trying to survive in places where they were repeatedly targeted. The reality is this: both groups are sincere, both are speaking from genuine belief, but they are not talking about the same story. One is describing a spiritual narrative, the other is describing a historical process. And you cannot understand 1948 if you only hold one of those. And that is why this conversation needs patience, not accusations, not assumptions, patience. Okay, guys, we are not here to attack anyone's belief or dismiss anyone's history. We are here to take the version many Christians grew up with and place it side by side with the version historians have documented. So we can finally see the entire picture without fear, without defensiveness, and without pretending one cancels the other. And to understand how these two very different stories formed, the spiritual one and the historical one, we need to start long before 1948, because 1948 was not the beginning of anything. It was the moment when several older forces finally collided. If we want the truth, we have to go back to the world Jewish people were living in before the modern state existed, okay? And here is the part many people miss. Jewish identity carried two realities at the same time: a spiritual memory and a physical experience. And you cannot tell the story honestly if you ignore either one, all right? On the spiritual side, Jews held a deep ancient connection to the land of their ancestors. This connection was not political. It wasn't tied to modern borders, as we said last time. It wasn't about armies or governments. It lived in their prayers, their festivals, their songs, their scripture, and the rhythm of their weekly life. Even though they were scattered across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, their faith kept pointing back to the land of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and Solomon. But on the physical side, the side that doesn't appear in our Sunday services, their reality in Europe was collapsing. The laws they lived under, the neighborhoods they were restricted to, the violence they faced, and the hostility growing around them were becoming unbearable. Their spiritual longing for the land remained the same, but the world around them was changing in a way that made survival their new priority. By the 1800s, something important had shifted. Jews still carried the same prayers, okay? The same scriptures, the same longing. That part never changed. But the environment around them, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia, had become unstable and openly hostile. Laws decided where Jews could live, decided what jobs they could hold. The same laws even decided which cities they were allowed to enter. And millions were pushed into a restricted zone called the Pale of Settlement, not because they did anything wrong, but because the state viewed them as outsiders in their own towns. And on top of all this pressure came pogroms. We mentioned them at the beginning. These are organized attacks on Jewish communities that destroyed homes, burnt synagogues, and left families with absolutely nothing. This was not just discrimination anymore. It was fear, and this was daily. The kind of fear where a family goes to sleep unsure of whether whether their house will still be standing the next morning. And this is where the spiritual and physical words begin to collide, because even as Jews prayed next year in Jerusalem, many were asking a new question they had never asked before. Where can we survive? And it wasn't a question of prophecy. It wasn't a question of timing. It wasn't about building a kingdom. It was about safety, real immediate physical safety. And inside the Jewish world, this new fear created real debate. For generations, most Jews believed that returning to the land would only happen when the Messiah came, meaning that restoration was God's responsibility, not something humans should organize politically. But as the violence in Europe grew worse, that belief was tested in a very painful way. Families began asking a question their ancestors never had to face. What if waiting means we won't survive long enough to see the Messiah? Some felt this question was almost like challenging God. Others felt it was simply facing reality. And in that tension, a new practical idea slowly emerged, not to replace faith and not to dismiss the scripture, but because the people were scared. If this continent says we don't belong here, and if no government can protect us, then maybe we need a place anywhere where we can live without fear. And that is the moment modern political Zionism begins to take shape, not as a religious mission, not as a fulfillment of prophecy, but as a survival plan. But at the very same time, a completely different conversation was happening in parts of the Christian world, especially within Protestant and later evangelical circles. Many Christians saw these same events and interpreted them through the Bible. Some believed the growing push for a Jewish homeland might be part of God preparing the world for the end times. Others believed God could use human decisions, even political ones, to fulfill his promises. And others completely disagreed, arguing that biblical prophecies were spiritual, not political, and that rebuilding a modern state had nothing to do with the scripture. So, while Jews were debating survival versus tradition, Christians were debating prophecy versus interpretation. We are talking about the same events, but two very different spiritual conversations. And this is why it is important to separate things clearly. Because as you can see, inside Judaism, the ancient spiritual longing for the land is real, deep, and sacred. But the modern political movement was born from fear and safety, not from a countdown to prophecy. And then you come to Christianity. Some saw the Jewish return as biblical fulfillment. Others saw it as a human political project that should be judged by justice and ethics, not prophecy. While others simply did not connect to the scripture at all. These two movements, Jewish survivalism and Christian prophecy interpretation, grew side by side but were driven by completely different motivations. One came from memory, covenant, and prayer. The other came from danger, persecution, and the need for protection. And Christian reactions came from theological interpretation, not lived experience. That is the real, balanced foundation of the modern story. Once you understand those two separate conversations, Jews asking how to survive and Christians asking whether prophecy was unfolding, the next part of the story becomes much clearer, because this is the point in history where discussions stop being emotional reactions and start turning into real plans. And before I introduce you to Hazel, a man very instrumental in the making of the state of Israel, we must make something very clear. Who exactly were the Jews at this time? And this is where many people get confused. Now, in the late 1800s, Jews were not one single community living in one place. They were scattered across many regions, the result of centuries of exile, wars, expulsions, and shifting empires. you had Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe. These are places like Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and these were the largest group and the ones facing the heaviest discrimination and pogroms. Then you had the Sephardi Jews in places like Turkey, Greece, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. These are the descendants of Jews expelled from Spain in 1492. And then you had the Mizrahi Jews in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Iran, and Morocco, communities that had existed there since ancient times. These communities had different languages, different customs, and different histories, but they shared two things: a common religious identity and a shared memory of the land described in the Hebrew Bible. So when we talk about Jews needing safety, we are not talking about a small group, guys. We are talking about millions of people living across many countries, but especially concentrated in Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, where life was becoming unbearable. Now, bring Christians into the picture. Christians were not one group either. They were divided into Catholics, Orthodox Christians, Protestant churches, and later evangelical movements. Each of these traditions read the Bible differently. So when Jews debated survival, Christians were having their own internal debates about prophecy, theology, and the end times. And this brings us now back to this man, Theodor Herzl, not a prophet, not a rabbi, not a religious leader, but an Austrian Jewish journalist working in Europe's intellectual centers. Herzl did not grow up dreaming about rebuilding ancient Israel. He was a modern secular European Jew. He believed in assimilation, education, and progress. But then he saw something that changed his entire worldview. He was in Paris, the capital of enlightenment, He was covering the Dreyfus affair, where a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason simply because he was Jewish. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Death to the Jews, death to the Jews," And this was not medieval Europe, guys. This wasn't an uneducated village. This was Paris or Paris. Herzl watched the hatred firsthand and reached a terrifying conclusion. If even the most advanced country in Europe can turn against Jews, then nowhere is safe. And that realization did not make him, more religious. It made him more practical. He began writing openly. What we need is a country where Jews can live without fear. Any country. Argentina was considered. Cyprus was considered. Parts of the Middle East were explored. And eventually, East Africa, what the British called the Uganda scheme, which was actually land inside Kenya, was also considered. Herzl's thinking was very simple. This is not about prophecy. This is not about the scripture. This is about survival. His ideas spread among Jewish communities who were desperate for safety, but things did not magically become unified. There was no moment where millions of Jews suddenly agreed and they said, yes, let's build a homeland. No, things were messy, emotional, people were divided, and they were also shaped by different realities depending on where Jews lived and what they believed, and also how much danger they were facing. Remember, we said they were spread across the world. Anyways, let's slow down and step inside that world. Remember, Jews in the late 1800s were spread across dozens of countries. So their reactions depended on their environment. Eastern European Jews, the one we said were in Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, and they were the communities living through the worst pogroms. To them, Herzl's idea felt like oxygen, not because they did not believe in the Messiah, but because they did not think they would survive long enough to see him. For these families, the conversation was very simple. Do we stay and risk death, or do we look for a future somewhere else? Political Zionism, a practical homeland, started to gain real support here. And then you go to the Western European Jews, the ones in France, Germany, Austria, or Hungary. These These Jews were more assimilated. They spoke the local languages, attended universities, worked in government, sometimes even served in the army. To them, Hazi's idea felt very uncomfortable, even insulting. Many responded and said, "We are not living in Europe. We are Europeans. This is our home." They feared that a political Jewish homeland would make anti-Semitism worse because it could feed the idea that Jews did not belong in Europe. So Western Jews were very cautious. Some rejected Zionism completely. And then you go to the Middle Eastern and North African Jews, the ones in Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Egypt. These communities had ancient roots, some going back to before even Jesus. They lived under Muslim majority societies and were not experiencing the same racial anti-Semitism that existed in Europe. So to many of them, Hazi's project felt distant, almost like a European issue. This has nothing to do with us. Then Jewish thinkers and community leaders realized something uncomfortable. Talking about safety was no longer enough. They had been discussing safety for decades, but by the late 1800s, the violence in Europe was getting worse, not better. Pogroms were spreading, restrictions were tightening, and anti-Semitism was no longer just religious. It was becoming racial, meaning that even conversion or assimilation could not protect you. So that conversation slowly turned into something new. They started planning, and this planning turned into meetings, and these meetings turned into ideas, and then the ideas turned into proposals, and eventually these proposals turned into an organized political movement. And this is where Hazi steps fully into the picture again. Remember, he didn't begin as a spiritual leader. He was not a rabbi. He was not quoting the scripture. He was just a journalist in Europe who watched anti-Semitism rise even in places that claimed to be modern and civilized. So when he called the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he was not creating a religious gathering. He was creating the first major political meeting to discuss Jewish safety. The Congress took place in Basel, Switzerland, a neutral territory where Jewish leaders from many countries could gather without fear. Remember, guys, Jews at this time were not one single group. They were scattered across Russia, Poland, Austria, Turkey, everywhere, right? So when they came to Basel, they came with different histories, different cultures, and different fears. And that is why the Congress was not unified or simple. People disagreed on almost everything. Some believed we need a spiritual homeland and not a state, a place to revive our culture, language, and identity. Others said, no, a cultural center won't stop pogroms. We need a real political state with borders and protection. Others still argued, maybe we can negotiate autonomy inside Europe. Maybe we don't need to leave. And then religious leaders debated, is it even right to try to return without the Messiah? So you can imagine the room. People were excited, nervous, divided, but they were also all aware that time was running out. Despite all the disagreements, one shared truth kept everyone in the same room. If we don't create a plan now, the next wave of violence might destroy us. And that urgency, guys, that urgency, not the prophecy, not politics, not theology, is what turned talk into a movement. Hazi wrote in his diary that night, in Basel, I founded the Jewish state. But he did not mean a state tomorrow. He meant the idea had finally taken root. And at this point, they still did not even know where that state could be. Palestine was not even the only choice. And this is where many people, especially around the world, get surprised. Because the early Zionist movement was not initially Israel or nothing. They were looking for any place where Jews could live safely. And this included, as we said, Argentina, Cyprus, even the Sinai Peninsula. Parts of the even Ottoman Empire were considered, and eventually East Africa. Anyways, I know a lot of you are interested in East Africa, so I'm going to touch on that a little bit. The idea for East Africa came from the British government, which suggested a region they called Uganda, but was actually in modern-day Kenya, the Rift Valley Highlands. So why was Kenya even considered, someone might ask? Because pogroms, the attacks on Jews, pogroms in Russia were getting worse. Hundreds of Jews were being killed. Entire villages were terrorized. Refugees were flooding Europe. Britain, at that moment, the most powerful empire on earth, looked at the crisis and said, we can offer land in East Africa as temporary refuge while you guys figure out your final homeland. To Jews escaping violence, this sounded like a lifesaver. Somewhere safe, you know. Now, even before the next massacre, we have somewhere that we can go. And then, to the Jews who are deeply tied to the biblical land, the idea was very painful. How can we go to Africa? Our prayers point to Jerusalem. So the movement split, and this is where the Christian angle also matters, and we have to address it. Some Christians said, maybe God can use Africa first. Maybe this is the part of a longer journey, you know, and others said, no. If it's not biblical Israel, then it's not God's plan. So the debate was happening inside both communities, Jews and Christians, but for very different reasons. This Uganda plan eventually failed for several reasons, and it's important to understand each one clearly. Number one, spiritual meaning. To Jews, Africa had no spiritual connection. Their prayers, songs, scriptures, and identity pointed towards the land of their ancestors, not a new land thousands of kilometers away. And then there is identity. A homeland is not only about safety, it's also about belonging. To many Jews, Kenya felt like creating a new identity from scratch, not returning to one they already had, okay? And of course, Africans resisted, and this part is often left out of Western history. Local communities in East Africa, especially the Maasai and other groups, were concerned and opposed to the idea of a mass settlement of Europeans, Jews included. They were already dealing with colonial land seizures and did not want another wave of outsiders taking their land. So Africans themselves said no. And then there's the internal Zionist vote. When the Zionist Congress eventually voted, the majority rejected the plan. They decided that any homeland must also connect with Jewish memory and history. And this does not mean Jews rejected Africa out of arrogance. It means they wanted security and continuity. This is them just wanting safety without losing their identity. And of course, there's the temporary refuge idea. This was very risky, and some people feared it. They said if we go to Africa, the world will forget our original homeland, and we may never reach Palestine at all. So Kenya became a debated but rejected idea. And also, this is an important chapter because it shows clearly the Zionist movement was not born out of biblical prophecy. It was born out of fear. And Palestine became the focus, not because it was empty or because prophecy required it, but because it was the only place that joined safety with identity and also memory and history. So let's take our time here, because Palestine is not just a location on the map. It is a land with layers, you know, and we are talking about spiritual layers, emotional layers, historical layers, and human layers. And if we don't understand those layers, nothing that comes after this will make sense. Before anyone called it Palestine, the land had many names depending on who ruled it and who wrote its history. In the Bible, it was often called the land of Israel, Canaan, Judah, or simply the land. The Romans later renamed it Syria Palestina after crushing a major Jewish revolt in the 135 AD, partly to weaken Jewish identity by erasing the older name Judea. The Byzantines and early Islamic empires used variations of the term Palestine. The Ottomans managed it as several administrative districts, not one single unit, but locals still used Palestine in daily life. So when we say Palestine, we are talking about a region whose identity changed hands many times, but whose spiritual meaning remained powerful to the Jews, the Christians, and also Muslims. Now, for the Jews, the emotional connection to this land runs incredibly deep. This was the place where their entire story began, okay? Where Abraham walked, King David ruled, and where the first and second temples stood. And also, this was the place where prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah preached, where festivals like the Passover and Sukkot were anchored in real geography. And also, this was the place where covenant and identity intertwined. So when the Jews were not living there in large numbers, the land lived inside them. This is the only land they knew. Their prayer books, written over hundreds of years, always pointed back to Jerusalem. Their holidays were built around the rhythm of this land. Harvest seasons, temple rituals, historical events, name all of it, okay? Then their songs ended with the line, "Next year in Jerusalem." Spiritually, this land was not symbolic, it was their home. And now, here's the question many people ask, but rarely get a clear answer to. Were Jews chased out of this land? The simplest, most factual version is this. After the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD and crushed the final revolt in 135 AD, the Jewish population dramatically decreased due to killings during war, slavery, forced displacement, migration driven by harsh Roman rule, and economic hardship. But, and this is very important, Jews were never completely removed. A Jewish minority remained in the land continuously for centuries, in Galilee, in Tiberias, also in Safed, in Jerusalem, and in Hebron. So Jews were not fully expelled. They were scattered, weakened, and reduced, but not erased. And new populations came in over time, including Arab Muslims and Arab Christians. This is why the Jewish connection to the land is spiritual, historical, and emotional. But the Palestinian connection is physical, generational, and rooted in continuous presence. This is what people mean when they say two truths, two histories, same land, okay? So when Jews in Europe were deciding where a future homeland could be, places like Argentina or Kenya could offer physical safety, yes, but they could not offer the spiritual continuity, because even when Jews lived in faraway places like Ethiopia, Russia, or Iraq, the land of Israel remained the heart of their story, not politically, but spiritually. That is why when the Zionist movement finally had to choose, Palestine felt like the only place where safety and identity could meet. But here is the truth that is just as important. By the time the Zionist movement turned towards Palestine, Palestinians had been living there continuously for more than 1,000 years. Muslims, Christians, Jews, these were families rooted in the land through farming, trade, community life, and local tradition. So when Jewish leaders said, "We are returning home," Palestinians said, "But this is already our home." Hey there, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. And maybe before we continue, allow me to talk to you about our partners, All Smiles Rehabilitation Center. Because if there's one thing we rarely talk about openly, it's addiction. Because the truth is, every family has someone battling it. Sometimes it's alcohol, cigarettes, pills, or even stronger substances. But here's the thing, addiction is not a choice, it's a disease. And that's why places like All Smiles Rehabilitation Center exist, to help people heal, recover, and rebuild their lives. They offer a full 90-day recovery program with detox, therapy, nutrition, care, counseling, and real coaching for life after rehab. And the best part, it's all done in a peaceful, supportive environment with doctors, psychologists, recovery coaches, even simple joys like movie nights, or sports, or even book clubs. If you know someone who needs help, reach out today. All Smiles Rehabilitation Center is where healing truly begins, and their contact details are on your screen right now. Two communities speaking honestly, neither of them was lying. Neither of them was imagining things. Both were telling their truth from two different angles. And that is why this moment is so delicate. Jews were not inventing their connection. This was ancient. Palestinians were not denying Jewish history. They were defending their present. Jews said, we prayed for this land for 2,000 years. Palestinians said, we have lived on this land for more than 1,400 years. That is why the shift towards Palestine needed to be slow, careful, and carefully negotiated, respecting both histories and also both emotions. But instead, the world rushed. Europe pushed the issue without sensitivity. Empires made decisions without consulting the people living there. And everything collided. Because as soon as the Zionist movement decided that Palestine was the only place where survival and spiritual identity met, it collided with the most important fact. Palestine was already alive. They had villages, churches, mosques, synagogues, families, okay? There were markets, there were homes in that particular land. There were memories. Palestine was not just an empty land waiting for occupation. It was not just there waiting. This was a land that was alive and with people. And here's the part we often forget in modern debates. Most early Jews arriving in Palestine did not come imagining conquest. They were not going there for war. They went there imagining coexistence, okay? Buying land legally, farming alongside Palestinians, building towns quietly and safely. Their goal was safety. Palestinians' goal was stability. But the world around them, especially Britain, created conditions that made both sides scared of losing everything. And once fear enters a story, it controls everything that comes after. So let's slow down here, because this is where the situation moves from two communities trying to live in the same land to two communities being pushed into conflict they did not design. And here is what actually happened. Britain walks in at the worst possible time. Before World War I, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, okay? Life was not perfect, but it was predictable. Palestinian Muslims farmed and traded. Palestinian Christians ran schools and businesses. Small Jewish communities lived mostly in cities like Jerusalem, Tiberias, Safed, and Hebron. And people interacted daily, okay? They were going to the markets, weddings, festivals, there were tensions, of course, like in any other society, but not a national conflict. Then the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the war, and overnight, Britain becomes the new power in Palestine. Now, imagine this. A land with two communities already trying to figure out how to live together, okay, gets handed to a foreign empire that barely understands local life. And Britain did not walk in with one clear plan. They walked in with three contradictory promises, all made within just a few years. First, Britain promised independence to the Arabs, okay? They wanted to win Arab support against the Ottomans. Britain sent letters in 1915 to 1916 suggesting that Arabs would gain independence after the war. Many Arab leaders reasonably believed this, They also believed this included or at least affected Palestine. So Palestinians thought, we fought with you, surely we get a say in our own future, okay? So you see what Britain is promising the Arabs. Then Britain goes ahead and secretly promises the land to France, all right? At the same time, in the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, Britain and France divided the Middle East into zones they would control after the victory. This directly contradicted the promise to the Arabs. And then, as if that was not enough, Britain promised a national home to the Jewish people. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, okay? Well, also saying the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should be protected. What were they even saying? Did they say Jews will have civil rights or political rights? That was not even clear. And maybe to some Palestinians, they interpreted, okay, the Jewish people get to stay, but they don't get to have a say. You get what I'm saying? Because the Palestinians were the overwhelming majority. So they were not imagining a period where the Jews will come and then the Jews will be the one to say what gets done. They were like, we are the majority. It's okay, you guys can come, but stay here if you want to, but please, you don't get a say. So by the time Britain officially takes over Palestine in the 1920s, the land is standing on top of three clashing promises, okay? Arabs believe independence was promised. Jews believe a homeland was promised. Britain and France believe an empire map was promised, okay? Those promises cannot fit together no matter what. And now you have two communities starting to feel threatened, not by each other, but by Britain's contradictions. Jewish families escaping violence in Europe arrive in Palestine legally under British policy, okay? They are not coming as conquerors. They are running from the pogroms or the attacks. And also they are running from the discrimination and rising anti-Semitism. To them, every boat that arrives in Palestine is hope. But Palestinians watching those boats see something very different. They see, okay, the population balance here is shifting. Land being purchased by new organizations. Britain enforcing a vision they never approved, okay? And a growing fear that the land they've lived on for generations could slip away. And then Britain makes it even worse because they keep changing the rules. Sometimes they restrict Jewish immigration. Sometimes they allow more. Sometimes they promise partition. Sometimes they back away, okay? Sometimes they crack down on Palestinians. Sometimes they crack down on Jewish groups. Nobody trusts Britain at this particular point. Nobody trusts the future. Everybody is afraid. And when a land becomes scared, guys, small things become big things. A rumor at a holy site becomes a riot. A land purchase becomes a national crisis. A migration wave becomes an existential threat. A clash between two families becomes a symbol of something much bigger. This is now Jews versus Palestinians, okay? And this is how the 1920s and early 1930s unfold slowly, painfully, and with rising panic on both sides. Not because Palestinians and Jews suddenly hated each other. No, it's because Britain's contradictory policies convinced each side that the other might eventually erase them. And this is the moment when the ground starts shaking beneath both communities, okay? Jews fear Europe will destroy them if Palestine closes its door. Palestinians fear that if immigration continues without political equality, they will lose their land and become strangers at home. And Britain, the empire responsible for managing this land and crisis, keeps pouring fuel on both fires. And this is what sets the stage for what comes next. Not a clash between two people who hated each other, but a clash created by fear, confusion, and a foreign power that did not understand the consequences of its own decisions. Please, let's walk forward slowly. When you govern a land without clarity, you force everyone in that land into survival mode. And that's exactly what Britain did. Please think about it. Britain is the referee, but this referee keeps blowing the whistles in different directions. 1 month, they tell Palestinians, don't worry, we will limit immigration. The next month, they tell the Jews, we will open the doors. You know, Europe is becoming dangerous. We will open these doors for you. Then they turn around and tell France, don't worry, we are managing the territory. And then They tell the communities, we expect you to live peacefully under us. No one can plan their future in this environment. So what do communities do when the future becomes unpredictable? They stop trusting words, They stop trusting promises. They start preparing for the worst. That is the moment when fear becomes the engine of everything. Palestinians begin to fear losing their land. Jews begin to fear having no land at all. Britain fears losing control of the territory. Everyone is afraid, but for different reasons. And fear is the one thing that can turn neighbors into rivals, even without hatred. Now, let's enter the early 1930s, where the external world makes everything 10 times worse. Because, well, Palestine is dealing with Britain's confusion. Europe is dealing with something much darker. Anti-Semitism is rising. Hitler is gaining power. Jewish businesses are attacked. Jewish synagogues are banned. Jewish families lose their rights, their jobs, their citizenship, and even their safety. So more Jews try to reach Palestine, okay? Not because of Zionist ideology, but because every other door is closing on them. And every time a new wave of refugees arrive, Palestinians feel a deeper fear. What happens to us now as this grows, Manzi? Not because obviously they hate the refugees, but because the political system gives them no guaranteed future. And this is why it is important to say this clearly. Palestinians were not reacting to Jewish trauma. They were reacting to British decisions that made their own future feel unsafe. And again, Jews were not coming to erase Palestinians. They were coming because they were running for their lives. These are just two traumas overlapping on the same land. But Britain is still the only one with the keys. And then the tension finally erupts. Not because of religion, not because of a certain prophecy, but because of pressure. The 1930s become the boiling point. Palestinians see land being sold by absentee landlords. They see British soldiers enforcing decisions they had no voice in. They see their political rights missing from every official document, and they feel a slow squeeze on their future. Jews see both turned away in Europe. They see Hitler rising. They see anti-Semitism becoming low. And Palestine becomes the only realistic exit door, okay? So, two fears, two truths, both real. And Britain, again, is still switching between promises, making the fears worse. And when people live in fear long enough, as we said, something predictable happens. They break. They break emotionally, they break politically, they break socially, and that breaking point arrives in 1936. But let's walk into it gently, because this part is misunderstood by almost everyone. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 did not start because Palestinians hated Jews. It started because Palestinians felt Britain had closed every door that could give them a stable future. Think about what they were seeing. Immigration rising, land changing hands, no guarantee of political rights, British soldiers enforcing decisions from London, and then the growing fear that one day they would wake up and find themselves powerless in their own home. When fear mixes with hopelessness, revolt becomes the only language people feel they have left. So, in 1936, Palestinians rise up, not against Jews as individuals, but against the system shaping their lives. Their message was not complicated. It wasn't even extremist. It wasn't even violent at first. They demanded just three basic things. Number one, pause immigration until we gain political representation, okay? Number two, stop land transfers that displaced farming families, okay? Number three, give us a national government, the same right and any majority population would expect. These are not the demands of people trying to destroy someone else. They are demands of people trying not to disappear from their own home. And how does Britain respond? not with negotiation, not with a political plan, not with compromise, but with force, military force. And this is the moment where British decisions, Jewish fear and Palestinian frustration collide, setting the entire region on a path that leads directly to 1948. Let's break this down gently because the details matter here. When Palestinians begin their uprising, they are not a well-armed military. They are farmers, merchants, teachers, religious leaders, young men with barely any weapon. They are driven by fear that their homeland is slipping away. Britain sees the revolt as a threat to imperial control, not their misplanning. So their response is not subtle. It's overwhelming. They bring in tens of thousands of soldiers, armored vehicles, aircraft, new laws allowing military courts, mass arrests, collective punishment in entire villages. They impose curfews that last for days. They demolish homes of suspected rebels, sometimes entire neighborhoods. They arrest thousands, they execute leaders, and they exile many of the most influential Palestinian figures. This was not just them restoring order. It was breaking the spine of Palestinian political life. And also, let's talk about the Jewish community during this time. This part is important because we must be honest and very balanced. While Palestinians were being crushed under British military rule, the Jewish community, the Yishuv, was experiencing something completely different. Not because Jews asked for Britain to attack Palestinians, but because the British needed Jewish cooperation to keep the region stable. So, Britain allows the Jewish community to strengthen its defense organization, the Haganah. They were also allowed to build economic networks, form political institutions, run educational systems, and create organized structures that look very much like the foundations of a future state. Why? Because Britain trusted the Jewish community more than the Arab community. They trusted them politically and strategically. So, while Palestinians were being disarmed, Jews were becoming more organized and more supported. Not because one side was better, no, but because one side was being supported and the other side was being suppressed. Can we be honest, And this imbalance is what will matter 10 years later. Because the result, by 1939, you have two communities who are standing in two different conditions, Palestinians became politically fragmented, Leadership exiled or imprisoned. Military was weak. They were exhausted and traumatized, deeply distrustful of Britain. They were also unsure of what comes next. Then the Jews were politically organized, military prepared, with institutions that resemble a government. They were also motivated by fear of Europe and increasingly convinced that a homeland is the only path to survival. Not because Jews wanted to dominate Palestinians, but because Europe was becoming more dangerous by day. And then, as if the situation wasn't heavy enough, the world changes in 1939. Just as the revolt ends and Palestinians are left weakened, the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history begins, the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were murdered. You guys, you know the story. We'll get into it, the complete story, another day. In this particular part, you had entire communities that were wiped out. Survivors left with nothing but trauma and ashes. And this transforms everything because now Jewish survival is no longer theoretical. We will not compromise. This is urgent, this is immediate, and it's very raw. And Palestinians watching this from afar are terrified for a different reason. They had no role in Europe's genocide, yet they sense that their homeland may be reshaped because of it, not out of malice, but out of global guilt, out of geopolitical decisions bigger than them, and out of forces they cannot influence. Two communities, two tragedies, two traumas running side by side. And then you have Britain. Britain is now tired, bankrupt, and desperate to leave. They no longer have the money, the energy, or the political will to keep controlling a land that is now emotionally charged, politically divided, and on the edge of something much bigger than they ever expected. So what happens next is not a calm transition. It is not an organized handover. It is not even a thoughtful plan. It's more like a tired empire placing a ticking bomb on the world's table and saying, someone else deal with this. We are done. And once Britain decides to leave, everything that had been boiling under the surface for decades, fear, memory, displacement, identity, prophecy, politics, all those starts rising to the top, because the moment an empire steps out, people on the ground suddenly feel exposed. Palestinians are afraid that without British restrictions, immigration will explode and the land they've lived on for generations could disappear overnight. Jewish families are afraid that without British protection, local anger could turn into attacks, the kind of violence they had already lived through in Europe. So now, again, you have two communities, both terrified of the future, and one empire walking out the door without fixing the mess they created. And that's the part people never talk about. Britain did not solve Palestine. Britain abandoned it. And into that vacuum stepped who? The United Nations. Not because the UN understood the land, not because they even understood the deeper history, but because Britain essentially handed them a bleeding wound and said, please guys, stitch this up quickly. But the UN could not fix a century of trauma with a few meetings and a map. No, they were dealing with two people who had already been pushed into fear by decades of decisions they never controlled. So instead of calming the situation, the UN's involvement became the moment when all the unspoken tension broke open. Before this moment, guys, Jews and Palestinians were not in a full-scale war. Of course, there were tensions, clashes, frustrations. Yeah, those were there, but not like war. After this moment, everything begins to shift towards open conflict, because now the question is not, how do we live side by side? The question becomes, who gets to decide the future of this land? And that question, that single question, is what pushes the world into the next chapter of this story. A chapter where two wounded nations standing on the same land for different reasons are about to face choices that neither one is fully prepared for. And the world, watching from a distance, is about to make decisions that will reshape the Middle East for generations. The UN sends a committee to Palestine to study the situation. They speak to leaders, visit towns, observe refugee camps, walk through settlements, listen to both sides. They see a people rooted in the land for centuries and a people trying to return to the only land tied to their identity. Two wounded communities with real claims and real fears. And after months of debate, interviews, and political pressure, the UN does something that will change everything. They propose dividing the land, not based on who had lived there the longest, not based on who owned what first, not based on fairness, but based on the belief that if two people cannot rule one land together, they must rule separate lands, okay? That is how the 1947 partition plan is born. A map drawn hurriedly, lines carved through villages, borders slicing through farmlands, Jerusalem pulled out and placed under international control, a plan the world thought would solve the problem. But for Palestinians, the plan felt like punishment. They were the majority, yet given the smaller share of the land. They had lived there for generations, yet were being asked to give up towns that had never been in dispute. They had no role in European anti-Semitism, yet they were being asked to absorb the consequences of it. For Jews who survived Europe, the plan felt like the only lifeline available, a chance finally to have safety, dignity, and a place where no one could turn them away. Two different reactions, both logical, both emotional, both shaped by trauma and history. And as soon as the plan is announced, the ground begins to shake. Not because people wanted war, but because the land that held memories, identities, scripture, family, history, and survival for two communities was suddenly being redrawn by outsiders. And once the map hits the table, violence begins even before any state is declared, because suddenly it is no longer a discussion about the future. It becomes a fight over the present. For Palestinians, the UN map felt like a stranger walking into their home and deciding which rooms they could keep. Families who had lived on the same land for generations woke up feeling like the world had drawn borders through their olive groves, their orchards, their grandmother's kitchen, their village cemetery, and spiritually, it shook them. This was not just soil, this was inheritance. This was where their parents were buried. This is where their children were born, where their identity was rooted, okay? So when the map was announced, it felt like a wound that came from very far away, from Europe's crimes, from British contradictions, from global politics, from a world that did not ask them what they wanted. Meanwhile, Jewish families in Palestine saw the same map through a completely different lens. To many of them, this was the first time the world had offered them anything other than rejection. After centuries of being expelled, segregated, persecuted, and finally annihilated in Europe, the map looked like a doorway to safety, Spiritually, some saw the moment as a return, not because the borders matched the Bible, no, they did not, but because the idea of coming back to Zion had lived in their prayers for generations. Even Jews who were not religious still felt a deep emotional connection to the land, a memory handed down through rituals, scriptures, songs, and traditions, stretching back thousands of years. So, when they saw the map, even with all its flaws, they saw hope. Here you have two communities looking at the same piece of paper. One seen loss, the other seen life. And as soon as these two reactions collided, the land erupted. This wasn't yet Israel versus the Arab states. No, this wasn't armies and uniforms. This was neighbor versus neighbor, village versus village. People who had traded in the same markets, fetched water from the same wells, and recognized each other's children suddenly found themselves on the opposite ends of a fear neither of them had created. Jewish convoys trying to move between cities, especially between Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and the northern settlements, were attacked on narrow roads that cut through Arab villages, okay? Sometimes these convoys carried weapons, sometimes they carried food, medicine, or families trying to relocate. But in a climate where every group believes the other might erase them, every convoy starts to look suspicious. And the same thing happened on the other side. Palestinian farmers traveling to tend to their fields or families going to visit relatives found themselves stopped, detained, or caught in ambushes by Jewish militias who feared an attack. Ordinary movement became dangerous. Daily life turned into a battlefield without clear front lines. And spiritually, this period did not just trouble the people living in Palestine, it confused the Christian world watching from afar. Because to many Christians, the land was not just geography, it was the Bible, it was the sermons, it was prophecy charts, Sunday school lessons, the stories they had grown up with. So when they saw tension rising in Palestine, they did not only see the news, they saw the scripture, or at least they thought they did. Some Christians opened their Bibles and saw verses about Israel returning to the land. They read Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and thought, maybe this is what God said would happen. Maybe this violence is part of a bigger plan. Maybe the pain is necessary for prophecy to unfold. To them, every ship of Jewish refugees arriving in Palestine was not just migration. It looked like God is bringing his people back to their land. But other Christians saw the same events and felt something very different. They saw Palestinian families losing land, people dying, growing unrest, okay, Britain's contradictions, fear on both sides, villages breaking apart, and they asked, how can God be behind something that is causing so much suffering to innocent people? They were not rejecting the scripture. They were reacting to the human cost. So the Christian world also split, not out of bad intention, but out of different lenses. One side was reading prophecy, focusing on what they believed the Bible had predicted. The other side was reading suffering, focusing on what was actually happening to people on the ground. Two groups of Christians staring at the same land, the same events, the same headlines, and seeing two completely different meanings. And all of this is happening before any state is declared, before Israel exists, before the Nakba. We will talk about the Nakba in our next episode, before even the borders change. Britain is leaving, right? The UN has handed down a plan nobody fully agrees on. Palestinians felt pushed aside. Jewish refugees feel cornered by history. The land is now holding too much fear, too much trauma, too many promises, too many interpretations, and no mediator strong enough to calm any of it. And to that tension comes one announcement, a single declaration that lands completely differently depending on who hears it. In a simple hall in Tel Aviv, on May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders gather and make a statement the world had not heard in almost 2,000 years. The state of Israel is established. To Jewish people, especially those who had survived Europe's horrors, the Holocaust, this was not just political news. It was a breath of fresh air. It was dignity restored. It was the moment the world finally said, you belong somewhere. And spiritually, to many Jews, even those not religious, this felt like the echo of an ancient prayer. The longing whispered for generations at weddings, funerals, festivals next year in Jerusalem. Not as prophecy fulfilled in a dramatic supernatural sense, no guys, but as survival aligning with memory. A moment where history and faith touched the same place for the first time in centuries. But the other side, Palestinians, the same announcement meant something entirely different. This was the confirmation of their fears, not because they hated Jews, not because they rejected Jewish suffering, but because this declaration came with no guarantee for them, no clear future, no state, no protection, no voice in the decision that reshaped their homeland. To many Palestinian families, the announcement sounded like we no longer exist in the eyes of the world, and spiritually it hit them even deeper. This is the land of their ancestors too, their mosques, their churches, their fields, their olive trees, and suddenly it is being reorganized by global powers they had never met. So, while Jewish families celebrated survival, Palestinian families braced for loss. Two reactions, both sincere guys, both born from trauma, both happening at the exact same moment. Then Christians watching from afar are also split down the middle. Some saw May 14th as prophecy unfolding, as if biblical verses were stepping out of the pages, in real time. Others looked at the displacement already happening and asked, how can God endorse suffering? So even spiritually, the world was divided and it is still divided. There are people who are prophecy focused, Christians who are feeling the excitement. Then there are those who are justice focused, Christians who are feeling the alarm. And then you have Middle Eastern Christians who are living the displacement firsthand. So the spiritual truth was now just as contested as political truth. The declaration was only a few minutes old when the United States said, we recognize the state of Israel. The Soviet Union followed soon after, which shocked many people because the US and Russia agreed on almost nothing during that era. And then within hours, armies from neighboring Arab countries began moving in, but not because they were one united force with one master plan. Most of them were not even coordinated. They were reacting out of fear that the Arab population inside Palestine would now be pushed aside, fear that the new borders blocked their own national goals, fear that everything was changing too fast and too permanently. And from that moment forward, the story accelerates into one of the most painful chapters of the 20th century. Palestinian families running with whatever they can carry, Jewish families fighting to defend a fragile new state, Arab states entering the war they are not coordinated to win, the world watching through political and spiritual lenses that do not see the same reality. And it's in that confusion, that grief, that chaos that the map of the Middle East begins to redraw itself, not through careful negotiation, not through a fair process, but through the raw consequences of war. Villages falling, armies retreating, families fleeing, and borders being drawn by whoever holds the ground at the end of each battle. When the fighting finally stops in 1949, the land that had once been known simply as Palestine no longer exists as one whole piece. It is now three different worlds living side by side, each shaped by its own shock. In the new state of Israel, the mood is a mix of exhaustion, relief, and deep grief. Yes, there is joy, the joy of having a homeland after centuries of being outsiders everywhere, but there is also the pain of knowing this victory was paid for by trauma that many had barely survived. Holocaust survivors arrive with the weight of nightmares. Jewish refugees expelled from Arab countries arrive with the weight of uprooted lives, and the young state tries to absorb all of them at once, building houses, schools, roads, and an army, while still unsure whether the next attack will come tomorrow. Just across a new tense line in the West Bank under Jordanian rule, Palestinians are living a different reality entirely. They are scattered, some in towns they managed to remain in, others in refugee camps built almost overnight. Many thought they left their villages for a few days until things calmed down. But now they are staring at borders that tell them they may never go back. Families who once lived 2 hills apart now find themselves in different countries. Children grow up hearing stories, not of ancient history, but of their own homes they can no longer go back to. And then further south in Gaza, under Egyptian administration, life becomes even harder. A tiny strip of land suddenly holds one of the largest concentrations of refugees in the world. People live in tents that were meant to be temporary, waiting for a political solution that never comes. Every year, the waiting turns into a new form of anger, grief, and determination. And then there is Jerusalem, the spiritual center, not just for Jews and Muslims, but also for Christians across the world. After the war, even Jerusalem is split down the middle. West Jerusalem is under Israeli control. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Al-Aqsa, under Jordanian control. For the first time in its long sacred history, Jerusalem is cut in half by barbed wire, barricades, and army posts. And this is the point where the world's spiritual story and the region's human story begin drifting apart. Many Christians abroad looked at the new map and saw prophecy. A Jewish state exists, Jerusalem is back in Jewish hands, partly at least. The biblical return seemed to be happening in their lifetime. But Middle Eastern Christians were seeing something else. Their Palestinian Christian relatives pushed into refugee camps, ancient churches losing congregations, a holy land now filled with checkpoints, separation lines, and trauma, and a conflict that was no longer just political, but also personal. 2 Christian worlds, 1 spiritual book, 2 completely different realities. And that is why the conversation becomes so complicated, because there is spiritual excitement abroad that is colliding with human suffering on the ground. Neither perspective is fake, neither is malicious. They are simply born from different lived experiences. And Underneath all of this, the central tension remains unresolved. One people finally got a home after centuries without one. Another people suddenly lost their home, after centuries living in the same place. Two truths that cannot cancel each other out, no matter how much we try. Two traumas that cannot erase each other. Two memories now competing on the same land. And instead of calming the situation, the years after 1948 only deepened the uncertainty. Israel fears another attack at any moment. Palestinians fear they will never return. Arab states feel humiliated and angry, Western powers see geopolitics. Some Christians are seeing the prophecy. Others see injustice. And all of these interpretations shape the choices that follow. And this is why the period between 1948 and 1967 becomes so important. And this is where the seeds of the next war are planted. The war that will reshape the map again. We are not yet done, guys. The war that will define the occupation. The war that will shape modern Israeli identity. Modern Palestinian identity, guys. And modern Christian prophecy teaching. And that brings us to the next chapter. We can't cover that right now because we need to go to this chapter, the road to 1967, where everything we know today is born. And I think this is where we have to pause on today's episode, because before we rush into 1967, before we talk about occupation, prophecy, borders, and war, we need to breathe. I actually need to breathe, guys. I need to breathe and finish this coffee, We just need to breathe and sit with what we've just learned today. We've talked about a lot. We've walked through a century where two communities were not choosing conflict. They were falling into it, pushed by an empire, pushed by Britain, scarred by trauma, and terrified of losing the only thing every human being wants: safety. For Jews, 1948 was the first time in centuries they felt protected. For Palestinians, 1948 was the first time in centuries they felt uprooted. And to many Christians, 1948 was the first time prophecy felt like it had stepped into the news. 3 truths, 3 emotions, 1 land. And honestly, I hope we have learned a thing or two here. We are not here to pick sides. We are here to understand the fullness of this story. Because once you see the human, political, and spiritual layers together, you realize this is not just a simple who is right debate. Oh, who is right? Oh, Palestinians hated Jews. They hate Christians. They are Arabs. Oh, Israelis are like this. They hate the Jews. They did this and this. No. You realize this is not just a debate of who is right. It is a story of fear, memory, faith, identity, displacement, survival, all happening at the same time. And when we come back in episode 3, we will enter the moment that changes everything. How 1967 happened, why Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, why Palestinians call this an occupation, why many Christians call this prophecy, and why this single event still decides everything we argue about today. So for now, take a moment, let today's episode settle, and when we come back, we will step into the most defining turning points of the modern Middle East. And I know this has been quite long. I don't know if we did a good job putting it together, but just like we did the first one, I appreciate your feedback. Honestly, after going through the comments on our first episode, that really encouraged me to do this episode. I'm learning a lot, unlearning and relearning a lot. Why is it that when we talk about Israel and Palestine, we don't talk about what Britain did? Why is it that no one holds Britain accountable? Why is it that when we talk about these two people, we leave the people who played the huge role? The UN. Yes, the UN. Britain, the UN, the entire world. We don't talk about the geopolitics of this. We don't talk about who saw an advantage where. Why is it that it's always this versus this versus this? But you see how that came to happen? Because they made sure that their roles were forgotten. That when you guys talk about this chaos that they created, you don't talk about them. You talk about the people. And guys, I hope we've done a good job putting this together. This was one of the, I don't know, took a while to put together. But honestly, I don't know what your take home looks like. I want you now to go and extensively check something out that I just mentioned briefly. I want you to check the war from 1936 to 1939. I want you to check that. And then I want you also to check the war that happened immediately, even before the state of Israel was declared. And I want you to understand the reasons why. All right? I want you to understand the reasons why. And I really hope we can continue learning and relearning. And as I said in the beginning, this is not to shame anyone or to tell a group that your version does not matter. Everyone's version matters here, because I know we are watching this as three different people. We are either watching this as Christians who believe this is a prophecy that has been fulfilled. We respect that. We are also watching this maybe as Palestinians, or people who stand with Palestine, and people who are like, no, this was not fair. And we are also watching this as people who stand with Israel, people who stand with the Jews and say this was their land from the very beginning. They were coming back to what was originally theirs. So I respect that we are watching this as three different people. And when we do that, let us keep the comments on the comment section respectful. I always say you can agree or disagree respectfully, right? And I just want to thank you for the feedback on our last video on Israel. I was amazed by that feedback. God, you guys have gone on the comment section. You're doing the thing. You are even continuing the conversation on the comment section, which I love. And I love that all of you are keeping it respectful. Sawa sawa. So see you on the next one. We have 2 or 3 more episodes to go on this, and then I think we can wind up. And I can't wait to also bring you the story of Christmas. And no, let me not give you more on that, but a story is coming. Sawa sawa. Yeah, so guys, thank you. I want to say thank you also to everyone that has subscribed. We are ending the year in a very positive way. It's been quite the year, guys. It's been quite the year, and we are at 1.45 plus subscribers, which is absolutely amazing. You guys have done the thing. So thank you so much for supporting independent journalism. If there's one thing I am proud of, is how independent our network is. And it is because you people have decided to also support it fully by subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing this video, engaging with this video, and also by contributing financially. There's an MPESA number right there that you can channel your support to. You guys can also channel your support through PayBill. We also have a PayPal account. I see the contributions coming in. I'm amazed by your contribution, guys. So thank you so much. Continue supporting us, and on the other end, we will continue making sure that we continue bringing thought-provoking conversations that are going to help us do what we are doing this year and possibly next year. Learn and relearn. So thank you so much. If there's anything you can't share with me on the comment section, you guys know our email, info@lnn.digital. Feel free to share something on our email, whether it's a tip, a suggestion, a recommendation. We will take that as well. So feel free to let us know on the comment section. So till next time, guys, I hope you keep safe, and also just a huge shout out to LNN team for always making this happen. It's not easy sometimes, but we make sure that we bring you guys something. So we appreciate you. So see you guys on the next one. My name is Lynn Ngugi. Bye-bye.